That,
It's not
yeah.
anymore.
No. Well, and that's the other thing you could probably do is get an extra. You know. That- All we need is just.
Oh,
You're not.
I think I got it.
You got it?
I don't know. Something was. Part of the cast. Part of the one. Oh. We were having issues. He didn't like, I walked right by him, but he didn't.
The staff person. Let's just- Be there with the whole water.
How many?
Not allowed.
Okay, so which.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Put it off a different drive.
How are we doing?
Yes.
Just have that.
Oh, but I also see
Yes,
this.
you see that. So, would it be best for us to have that pointed at the screen and then I can try to talk loudly? For your microphone to be on and just have it pointing at.
Why don't you just move that laptop over about 6 feet, then it'll be closer to your voice.
Okay.
Well, yeah, you can
But
present
for some
from here,
reason,
but how is that going to change?
So I think like if I don't share the screen.
You know, with the
Oh,
stick people use.
but why
with
don't
the-
you share?
So,
Yeah, Andrew can just hold the laptop up on his desk.
I'm sharing that screen right now.
Oh, we just need to go back to the day of service. Everyone has to be here.
Yeah, but when we had the overheads, and some faculty would, it was kind of had the cranes with the plastic on it.
Yeah,
and the
like
cranes
that one.
And people would just literally write sticky notes down, so equation. Then you write it on this crane, they get a fresh, you keep writing equations, and then they can roll it back. So they have a
Like Deb said, maybe have that laptop. So Tim,
question. Specific
I'll just try to
learning,
talk as
like
loud as I can then.
Science, like biology, chemistry in high school, and.
But how's that changing what they see on WebEx?
Oh, well, maybe I just won't.
Yeah.
So could we just place it like right?
Oh, so they can see, oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so then they can kind of see.
All right, so you don't need to share now.
Okay.
I'm sorry, dustless chalk, because otherwise if you were in that black clothing, you'd be writing on the board and all this dust, you'd be writing in a cloud of dust and then it'd be all over everything. So these days, the markers are you ready?
All right, sorry for the delay. Do you have any announcements? Now, then Andrew will start right away.
Thank you all for coming. So the plan today is I will present for about 15 minutes and then I will leave the rest of the time open for discussion questions. Savannah, if you have any trouble hearing me, just let me know and I'll try to step closer.
And David said he would be joining by WebEx also.
Okay, it's just Savannah right now. Okay.
Figure it out.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Tangeman. This is my first year experience presentation. So as I mentioned, my name is Andrew. I'm a first year graduate student, and Dr. Deborah Steele Johnson is my advisor. Those are pictures of my dog and pictures of me at work as well. I'm currently a GTA for Psych 1010. I also currently work as a case manager at multiple long-term care facilities. During my first semester, I took interest in talent retention. I was interested in the theoretical foundation of talent retention, as well as actionable and practical talent retention strategies. Due to my experience working in the restaurant industry, as well as working as a case manager in the healthcare field, I have witnessed firsthand the negative impacts that a lack of talent retention strategies can have. This impact can be on the business as well as the employees of the business. My goal today is to present my experience at Wright State University. I plan to do this by presenting a concise summary of the literature that I have reviewed thus far at Wright State. However, I want this presentation not only to be a literature review, but I would also like to present the evolution and development of my research interests. So let's get started. This is a general overview of today's presentation. The majority of today's presentation will be a literature review regarding the following topics: talent retention, turnover intention, and intention to remain. I will conclude with a broad overview of my research focus regarding my thesis. So what exactly is talent retention? Ott et al. Defines talent retention as all of the activities and practices used by an organization to prevent the departure of talent. These activities and practices include, but are not limited to, enhancing employee engagement, implementing incentives, establishing norms and values, and enhancing effective communication. The definitions presented here are illustrations of the different ways that authors and practitioners define talent and talent retention. Most researchers refer to talent as employees that perform their job above and beyond other employees. In this sense, talent retention refers to the activities and practices used by an organization in an attempt to retain their top-tier employees. Practitioners interested in talent retention have also defined talent in regard to their own context. Gordon Ramsay Holdings defines talent as individuals who show the creative flair of chefs. Google Executives describes a talented individual as an ideas person who thinks outside of the box. However, in some cases, throughout literature, talent retention refers to strategies aimed at retaining all employees, not just top-tier employees. Ultimately, this lack of a standardized definition has created problems for developing theoretical models and talent retention plans. When reading literature regarding talent retention, be sure to understand what the author means by the word talent. So through my original quest to understand talent retention and work towards the development of talent retention strategies, I began to shift my focus towards measurements of talent retention. In my mind, I felt that before owners or managers of an organization can begin developing efficient talent retention strategies, they must first have the ability to assess retention rates within their own organization. The first measure of talent retention that I stumbled upon was turnover. So I'm sure all of you have heard of turnover. I will be brief in presenting the information that I have learned about turnover thus far. Simon Bergrist defines turnover as the rotation of workers around the labor market, between firms, jobs, and occupations, between states of employment and unemployment. Turnover can be calculated through a simple formula. That is, taking the number of employees who left during a specific period of time and dividing that number by the employees that were initially there at the beginning of the period. For example, in an attempt to measure turnover rates from January to August, you would determine the number of employees who left from January to August and divide that by the number of employees that were initially there in January. For the most part, turnover has been categorized into two forms: voluntary and involuntary. So first, involuntary turnover. This is most often referred to as an employee's decision to terminate the employment relationship. So this is, in essence, a decision on part of the company and occurs due to factors such as poor work performance and termination due to downsizing. Involuntary turnover is also referred to as an individual vacating their position due to factors outside of managerial control. Finally, involuntary turnover is sometimes referred to as unavoidable turnover. Voluntary turnover, on the other hand, is the voluntary and conscious decision on the part of the individual to leave an organization. Voluntary turnover is viewed as a behavioral outcome as a result of antecedents such as low levels of job satisfaction, low levels of job embeddedness, work-related shocks, and a lack of pay. Voluntary turnover is also sometimes referred to as avoidable turnover. There's a theoretical dispute between categorizing and defining different forms of turnover. Some authors believe that there is a clear distinction between terms. Other authors believe that there is no empirical evidence to support this difference. Finally, some authors believe that the voluntary-involuntary distinction exists on a continuum. However, regardless of the distinction, high turnover can have significant negative impacts on a company, such as decreased work productivity, loss of intangible knowledge and skills, and significant financial costs to the organization. So seen here is a graphical illustration of the major turnover models. These models describe the turnover process as well as define major antecedents of turnover. First, we have March and Simon's turnover as a rational decision model. This model predicts that job satisfaction prompts the consideration of alternative jobs. If dissatisfaction is strong enough and other jobs are available, the model predicts an employee will quit. Next, we have Mobley's intermediate linkages model. This model postulates that a decline in job satisfaction leads to withdrawal cognitions, which in turn can lead to an employee eventually quitting. Mobley also postulates that there are a number of moderating factors between withdrawal cognitions and turnover behavior. Some of these moderating factors include withdrawal intentions and job alternatives. Third, we have Muczynski and Morrow's model. This gives rise to the idea that labor market conditions, such as job demand, indirectly influence turnover through an individual's perception of job alternatives. This model also introduces the concept of distal antecedents such as organizational commitment and perception of job alternatives. Fourth, we have Lee and Mitchell's model of turnover as an unfolding process. This model recognizes the idea that turnover unfolds over time. However, turnover can also occur in response to shocks. Shocks are, in essence, jarring events that can be work-related or non-work related. Fifth, we have Mitchell and colleagues model. This model highlights the role of job embeddedness and its impact on turnover. And finally, we have Merritt's and Campion's turnover and control model. This model provides some distinction between the types of turnover. It also focuses on motivational forces such as affect and morality that push an employee to quit. Finally, this model also introduces the idea of perceived decisional control. Now, there's an absolute plethora on research regarding turnover. One author estimates there to be about 9,000 books alone. However, turnover is viewed as a poor measurement of talent retention strategies due to the fact that it is a distal outcome of these strategies. After reading this, as well as coming to the realization that it would be next to impossible for a graduate student to study turnover behavior, my focus began to shift once again. It was at this point that I began to research a variable known as turnover intention. Turnover intention is an individual's estimated probability that they are going to leave their organization at some point in the near future. In other words, this is an employee's conscious willfulness to leave the organization. So here are some of the relevant theories that have been used to define and understand turnover intention. I will define these theories in the context of turnover intention. So first, we have the social exchange theory. This theory proposes that employees analyze the relationship of their organizations on the basis of costs and benefits. Next, we have the expectancy theory. This theory highlights the idea that employees enter organizations with expectations and values. If these expectations and values are not met by the organization, then it is more likely that the employee will quit. Third, we have Adams' equity theory. This theory postulates that employees compare their input and outcome ratio with that of other employees. If those ratios are not equal, then the employee is more likely to quit. Next, we have the motivation hygiene theory. This theory illustrates the idea that job satisfaction and job dissatisfaction are driven by separate factors. This theory dictates that an employee will respond to turnover appeals when the job satisfaction factors become negatively affected. Fifth, the resource-based view. This theory posits that an employee stays in their current job position as long as they feel they are still valued and regarded as special. Next, the human capital theory. This theory emphasizes the importance of training, education, and development in an organizational context. And finally, we have the job embeddedness theory. This is, as it sounds, proposes the idea that an employee stays in their job. They feel a sense of belonging in their social and professional environment. So upon reviewing literature for turnover intention, I noticed something that struck me as quite odd. I noticed that some authors viewed turnover intention, referred to turnover intention as intention to remain. So Ahmad et al. Defines intention to remain as an employee's self-reported intention to remain in an organization. Recent research has replaced focus on why employees leave with why employees stay. Most authors, however, have treated turnover intention and intention to remain as the same variable. However, some authors have found clear differences between predictors of intention to remain and turnover intention. This idea led me to the development of my research interests that will be included in my thesis. Now, before presenting my research interests, I would just like to clarify the wording of some acronyms that will appear in the next slide. Intention to remain is the same as intention to stay, abbreviated ITS. Turnover intention is the same as intention to leave, abbreviated ITL. So my first interest is to investigate the potential discriminant validity between intention to stay and intention to remain. I plan to investigate whether ITS, intention to stay, and ITL, intention to leave, reflect two distinctly different but correlated variables. Next, which is closely related to the first, interest number 2, plan to investigate whether the way in which you operationalize measures of ITS and ITL have an impact on responses. Specifically, I want to investigate whether positively and negatively worded items create differential responses. This could explain the contrasting findings between differences in predictors of ITS and ITL. Finally, prior research has presented mixed results regarding antecedents of ITS and ITL. There's a huge replication issue within this stream of research. I wish to replicate prior research in an attempt to provide some clarity regarding the predictors of ITS and ITL. So in essence, measurements of ITS and ITL can provide practitioners with the ability to assess turnover without directly measuring turnover behaviors. If intention to leave and intention to stay truly represent different constructs, then understanding these differences will be a step towards more valid and reliable predictors of turnover. With the ability to predict turnover more accurately and consistently, practitioners will gain the capability to measure the outcomes of their retention strategies with greater precision. In turn, this research will guide academics and practitioners toward the development of effective and efficient retention strategies. So this concludes my presentation for the day. I will also show some pictures of some of the graduate students and our get-togethers, though, because this was a big part of my first year experience. So that's us at Oktoberfest. There's us at Hibachi from Works Going Away. There's birthday party for Maya over there. Here's another picture of Mark's going away party at Hibachi. They started throwing stuff at us during this. And there's some pictures of my dog. That's pretty much it. So, Scott?
So are you distinguishing between something like, I'm just trying to make sure I get your distinguish between sort of a continuum with intention to stay on one end and intention to leave on the other versus two independent processes? Because clearly the difference would be, if it's a continuum, then intention to stay and intention to leave would together, if you had a probability to equal 100, if they're separate, then there's no reason to equal 100, right?
Right. So Savannah, Scott asked, am I trying to distinct whether intention to stay and intention to leave rest on a continuum or if they are distinct variables? I think that's a great question. I would like to think that, like most variables, probably rests on a continuum. But I won't know, I suppose, until I do the research and try to provide some clarity with the distinction. It's pretty much it.
Well, I'm sorry, I want to tag right on that.
Mhm.
So Scott's fundamentally asking you whether you think, whether your starting point for this research is that ITS and ITL reflect different poles of one factor or reflect two factors.
So to answer the question directly, two factors.
Why?
Because the difference in predictors, I think, shows that they are essentially two factors. Now I guess I won't be able to see that until I do some things like exploratory
What does
factor
it mean,
analysis.
Factors.
So to have correlated variables,
So what does that mean in terms of, think about domains?
to
Because it's got one factor, I have one conceptual domain.
Mhm.
So you're saying there's two factors, so what does that mean in relation to domains, conceptual domains?
they represent two different constructs.
And completely independent?
No, not independent, definitely correlated, very related. So within literature, they've almost always been treated as the same concept. So no one's really investigated whether they lie on a continuum, whether they're distinctly different but correlated variables. I think they're distinctly different and correlated. However, it's hard to tell right now.
Someone be high on both.
Intention to leave and intention to stay? I don't know. Maybe. I think you could have conflicting feelings like that. You could have outside pressures wanting you to stay.
If you have different predictors, seems that could be high, right? If they're different predictors, so. Means,
We might not want to leave your job because you really like coworkers, but
Yep.
want to leave your job because maybe you don't like the actual work you're doing, or you have a poor relationship with your boss. I don't know.
Absolutely.
but
So it
the-
depends on the content of your two conceptual domains.
Yep. And the outside, like Riley said, the outside factors forcing you to either want to leave or stay.
Well, those outside factors as antecedents, some of them could be more strongly related to non-overlapping parts of the two conceptual domains. That's why you're going to have two different sets of antecedents. John?
So we have someone behind you
Oh,
who
sorry.
had, yeah,
No, I was just gonna add on, I think an example of being high in both is saying, I definitely love my job, I wanna stay here for 3 years. After that, I definitely wanna leave, and I'm not gonna get any more out of this, so I think that would be an example of being high in both.
It's a great example. Alex,
Have you, this could be a comment and a question. Have you seen anything on curvilinear relationships with these variables? So you're thinking about this being potentially a two-factor type of construct, right? As opposed to being continual, that ITS and ITL are sort of qualitatively different things. They might correlate, they might be related, but they're different constructs. And your evidence for this, as you pointed out, was that you've seen some discriminant validity evidence in literature. I think yesterday you and I were talking about job satisfaction, that it correlates positively or negatively with one of them, and then it correlates basically zero with the other end, which is suspicious, because you would think it would be the opposite correlation with the other one, right? I think that near zero correlation on one end, but it being not near zero on the other end might really indicate curvilinearity. That there's the correlation isn't straight, right? It curves off or maybe goes back down. Because truly, the definition of these two constructs, when Jan asked, can you have one, not the other? We could think of some counterexamples, but I think the two constructs are so highly related that the curvilinearity may be leading us to think that there's two different constructs, when in reality, they just have abnormal relationships with some things, then they're really the same thing. I think that's just something to consider.
thank you.
So what did the, no. So address the success. So can you think
Wow.
of an example? What would it look like if there was a curvilinear relationship between what's on my X and what's on my Y? Where's this curve go?
I'm sort of confused. So like a real world example of the curvilinear relationship between.
So for example, because I'm dealing this with a couple, I hope God it's not curvilinear, because it sets up degrees of freedom, it's hard to detect, so I'm talking to my two current master's thesis students. But in fact, I can tag on one of them now. So you've got a curvilinear relationship, so tell him what curvilinear relationship you were looking at, and then he can maybe give us an example from his research interest area.
So for me, I was looking at a quadratic. So instead of like a diminishing return, I'm looking at like an upside down U.
Right.
So essentially, in my research, I'm trying to locate this threshold of essentially optimization to where too little of something is not good. Too much of something is also not good, but there's a sweet spot essentially of what is beneficial to the employee.
And what's on the X and what's on the X?
For me,
Cyber loafing.
yeah,
And on the Y,
uh, is productivity. And then the moderator that I'm looking at is job complexity.
so she's positing that when complexity deviates from, you get the highest cyber loafing performance relationship when you have most moderate levels of complexity, otherwise it's off. You've got a different kind. What's your relationship?
Diminishing return effects was an example, autonomy and job satisfaction.
Okay.
So autonomy is really gonna only get you to a certain level of job satisfaction.
Yeah.
It's gonna start tapering off and to experience higher levels of job satisfaction or to maintain that linear line. It might require other higher levels of other positive job characteristics, right?
So you're looking at intention, stay intention as an outcome. So that would go on your Y-axis. Can you think of an antecedent that might have like, you know, a stronger increasing relationship with intention to remain up to a certain point, and then more of that X factor doesn't really matter anymore?
Yeah, so I mean, throughout literature, job satisfaction, I would say is a big one. Maybe even the mediating effect of organizational commitment
So
of
do you
job
think job
satisfaction.
satisfaction on your X, do you think that would have a bowl effect? Can you draw a picture, bowl effect?
It's,
Increasing, diminishing, or rapidly decreasing, or?
I couldn't see it being a diminishing return.
Draw me a
That doesn't
picture.
make sense to me. I mean,
So what's on your X-axis and what's on your Y?
why? ITS, ITL.
Well, pick one, dear, because of the
Pick one.
opposite relationships
Alright.
depending on.
We'll do ITS and then job sat. So
Okay.
as job sat increases, so does the intention to stay. I couldn't see there being any type of diminishing return for that.
So you think it's sort of low to moderate level satisfaction, you're not gonna see it much of an effect on ITS.
Yes.
And then as satisfaction gets above a certain point, you'll see really some great advantages to increases of it.
Yes.
Anybody want to debate them on it? Oh, she does.
What about money?
Oh, yeah, okay.
So
Money.
there's research to suggest, you know, about 70,000 valve, you're not really gonna be any much happier. I think that might be similar in a job sucks that much, I don't care how much money I'm making, it's not worth it, so it's not gonna be like an inverted U, it's probably just gonna level off.
So you're saying money is a moderating factor between intention to stay and job satisfaction?
No, she was actually, I think she was actually saying, money on your X with intention to leave.
Okay.
And so block what she just said. Can you say what you said just one more time?
You know, after a certain point, making more money isn't gonna make you want to stay. So I think it would
Okay,
be,
so it's just gonna plateau.
that's
Okay.
what I'm picturing.
Okay. So pay as a, and then do you think it would have the
If we
same
have a
relationship?
We probably would have more of sort of the first half. Rather than, we don't usually see an OJI for that, and I suppose you could.
It's a good idea.
In the literature right now, are there two separate developed scales for both of these constructs?
There's a lot of different scales. There's not one that's really used more than another. I found one that I've judged as most consistently used. It's only mentioned a few times. It's cited more than anything else. But I requested the scale from the author, and to me, it seems to measure at least 2 or 3 different variables. It's got a job satisfaction question, organizational commitment question, and it rarely ever asks, do you intend to leave the organization? Do you intend to stay at the organization?
So but both of these constructs are in the literature, but they don't both have scales or they do both have scales?
They do both have scales, but so in literature, it's typically referred to as intention to remain. However, when an author measures intention to remain, sometimes they only ask, or I'm sorry, turnover intention. So typically it's viewed as turnover intention in the literature. So intention to leave is how that translates. But when authors ask those questions, they'll sometimes only ask, do you intend to stay? And
How likely is it that you'll still be at this job and?
yeah, or sometimes I'll ask, do you see yourself at a different job in the future? So there's really no standard on the measurement itself, intention to leave and intention to stay. Then some ask both. A lot will include some job satisfaction measure within there, organizational commitment measure, and they just say it's turnover intention.
Items in there.
Doesn't that imply that these folks are viewing it as just two sides of the coin, right? So they are single, you could think of it as a continuum, or it's like, because if I measure, I would just code those questions that talk about staying negatively and they become intention to leave, right?
They absolutely do. And I think very, very, very rarely has anyone addressed that fact within literature, if they are two sides of the same coin or not.
Although you've got one study.
Yeah, I have about 3 or 4 now where they do provide evidence that these are
Have different antecedents.
correct. Well, yes, yeah, different antecedents.
You mentioned, you listed off a whole bunch of theories there.
Mhm.
Would any of those inform possibly a prediction that you made that is either one dimension or two dimension?
I mean, it's somewhat motivation hygiene, but I think we've talked about
Oh,
that.
God, you don't.
No, and I'm not gonna do that. And so the comparison between job satisfaction, diff satisfaction, having separate factors, and then intentionally.
Which has been refuted,
But-
by the way.
Right.
Well,
I'm not doing that.
Motivator hygiene theory, okay.
I'm not doing that. So job embeddedness has been seen to be have a relationship with intention, turnover intention. So it hasn't been viewed in the aspect of those intentional to stay and intentional to leave being separate variables. It's just been viewed as turnover intention. So it's an antecedent of turnover
When
intention.
you look at these and think, gosh, embeddedness theory, because it's talking about this, the nature of the conceptual domain is this.
Mhm.
I think that's more related to intention to leave or alternatively intention to stay.
Yes,
Do you think, well, for example, you might have two, if you have two actual conceptual domains, if it is two factors, which is an open question,
Mhm.
if it's actually two factors, it might be, for example, that one conceptual domain really kind of addresses more of sort of the cognitive aspects of it, something else is more affective. Do you see any distinctions in the conceptual domains of ITS? I don't notice either. He hasn't talked to me about this yet. We haven't gotten that far.
So do I see any of these theories representing the strongest difference between intention to stay and
Right.
intention to remain?
And would that inform you about, in your head, why you think these two conceptual domains might be distinct?
Not right, just face validity, but
Let me give you one more example, maybe it'll trigger some thinking.
Okay.
In goal orientation,
yeah,
so they've looked at 1 to 4 to one person even had a 6-dimensional model. People pretty much landed on 3 or 4. But in one conceptualization, who has some support for it, they said it's fundamentally different for people who are trying, so goal orientation is my desire to demonstrate good performance. But I can do it for different reasons, either because I just want to learn more and want to master this thing, versus I want to prove to others that I'm competent. And so the mastery one tends to be much more related to sort of intrinsic motivation, control kinds of variables. Whereas the other dimension, its domain is much more reflecting concerns over appraisal by others, concerns about evaluation, people judging me, self-presentation. So they actually are capturing different conceptual content. Do you have any preliminary ideas about what the different conceptual content?
yeah. I guess equity theory reminds me about that the most. So comparing your input-output ratio to others in the organization. So you have that comparison, and then if you feel those are not viewed as the same, so potentially your intention to stay while viewing others' outcome and input ratio, so what they're putting in could
So
be
social
different.
comparisons might be more strongly, when it might be more overlapping, help you better understand intention to stay than intention to leave.
Maybe. I haven't honestly applied many of these theories yet to intention to stay and intention to leave distinction. I think a lot of these adequately explain turnover intention. However, I don't know if they're
Unidimensional.
right. I don't know if they're applicable to the distinction between intention to leave and intention to stay.
That's what you're gonna have to figure out.
Right.
Stop abusing me.
Okay.
More of a comment and just like a caution, you probably already know this, but I would look at the sponsoring, or whoever sponsored the data collection, because if the company is sponsoring the data, your participants might be reluctant to answer honestly about leaving.
Yeah.
Whereas if they are doing it on their own time, or if they're like students, and they know their job isn't gonna find out about their answers, they might be more honest.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, thank you for that. I think that's a great point too. I think that reluctancy in saying that you're going to leave might be one of the driving factors between the possible distinction between intention to stay and intention to leave. So,
Do you think some people came up with the intention to stay? To try and maybe address that issue, that people might be willing to report more moderate levels of intention to stay
possibly,
versus,
Yeah.
not wanting to report relatively higher levels or
Yeah.
lower levels of intention to leave?
definitely possible. Most people they don't directly measure the difference between intention to stay and intention to leave. So they either treat turnover intention as the same or as a unidimensional factor, or they'll say intention to stay, referring to turnover intention. So they don't directly assess the distinction between the two.
And you're going to have to, in your intro for your thesis, to explain why you think there's a difference between them.
Okay.
Using these or other theories, so you're gonna have to give something. And you could very well be wrong, we're often wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
what kind of study do you envision doing?
So definitely just surveys, not experimental design. The only thing I could think of in experimental design would be testing different operationalizations, but I'm not doing that at all.
Okay.
So correlational studies, exploratory factor analysis, so seeing if factor loading of different items represents two variables or just maybe one variable, so multiple factors or just a single factor. CFA, which I don't entirely know too much. We just learned about EFA and CFA yesterday, so trying to sort of all integrate it together. But hopefully that answers your question in some regard.
Both of these imply measuring a bunch of variables and then see how those variables group cluster together. But you also probably have measures of the dependent variable like ITS and ITL.
Yep.
And that suggests some kind of regression.
So I plan to gather at least a few of the most validated scales of ITS and ITL. So really just turnover intention, because they don't typically distinguish between the two. So the most validated scales that I can find and see how different items load onto them. Or factors load onto the
You would
items.
regress ITS or ITL onto what?
Onto, what do you mean?
You're gonna have you said you're their outcomes, so what are you gonna be your predictors?
So different variables like job satisfaction, job embeddedness, any variables that I can find differences within that have showed any differences within literature.
Showed any differences, or you have looked at prior theory to inform?
Prior theory as well. So
Maybe
both.
to start.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Oh.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna take the pressure off Andrew for a sec.
No.
He inspired me to ask the question that I thought was interesting. Jan asked him about experimental design, and Andrew said the only way he could think of an experimental design for this, for his interests, would be to give people different survey measures. And you'd really be looking at the sort of it'd be it's experimental design to look at the constructability of different survey measures and see which ones, correlate to different outcomes the best or whatever. I'm asking the more experienced researchers here, is that a thing? Have you seen that sort of research where people experimentally give different measures of the same construct and they're looking at constructability?
I have not, but I have seen back in the Jeanette days underpinning equity theory, where they did a lot of the early tests of equity theory. They actually set up simulated organizations and paid people under different payment systems, and they saw. So he could do that. He could set up noxious tasks and see, and nicer tasks and look at relative. He could set up fake companies. That's a lot of work and trouble.
And yeah,
It's a lot of time.
We could do, vignettes is a more common thing. It's easier, cheaper, faster, vignettes. So yeah, you could set up some things, but how likely in this vignette, how likely are you to stay or leave?
Yeah,
And look at other indices, predictors of that.
that'd be cheap.
Because then you could actually build certain features into different vignettes. But he's got to be theoretically driven as to what's driving him to these different, what he thinks are two. Well, that helps her too. She's got to figure some of this out.
I know we could do a vignette, or I know we could do a vignette study, or we could do, I have done those studies where you build a workplace. I did undergrad with Legos, and it was and it was basically
Probably didn't really behave that.
yeah, it was all that.
It is.
But I'm asking, like, I'm actually experimentally manipulating the measures, the self-report measure, like systematically varying that between participants and seeing if that has a systematic effect. To me, this is, I've seen studies where you put 3 or 4 measures of the same construct into one cross methods survey, and you do an FA or something with it and see if, how much the different scales correlate. But I wonder if there's added usefulness to using different surveys as manipulation, and if that would, if you actually.
You kind of is doing that in a way, because one of our issues, concerns, interests is positive versus negative key items. So we would do it within subject, and administer the same subject, parallel item sets, pairs, negatively positive key, and see if they have
Right.
different effects. That would capture part of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think so, because the two outcomes, intention to stay or intention to leave, are certainly to us would be opposites, right? And so it could be sort of related to what Sasha said. It may be that even people in general, when speaking about perhaps any job they have, may be more inclined to talk about whether they'll stay versus whether they'll go. I mean, it may just be that.
It could be all sorts of things, like how desirable was this job when you first applied, or how desirable do others perceive the job to be, how hard, escalation
Right.
of commitment,
Where-
there's
where
could be
the-
all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it could be lots of
Mhm.
things, like people say, oh, you're so lucky to have that job. And you like think it sucks. But you're like,
Others,
like,
I don't
yeah,
know.
so,
So it might end up being in some ways an artificial distinction, like motivator hygiene theory, in the way you set up the items actually dictated the response
which,
to make it look different when it wasn't really. That's a distinct possibility.
Oh,
Andrew, have you looked at any individual difference variables that are relevant? I could think of having huge variance here where, on Tuesday, I really want to leave HFIO, but then on Friday, I don't want to leave.
Yeah.
And day by day, my intended turnover varies.
Yep.
And I think that's probably true of a lot of people in a lot of their jobs. Did their manager yell at them today or yesterday? Did they get a bonus today or yesterday? And, these sort of things.
yeah.
And,
Um,
so,
Did they have a good or a bad day?
yeah, things like their job performance, or, I don't know, their conscientiousness or something might be a really interesting control variable when you get further on.
I absolutely have to. Impulsivity is.
Yeah, that's a great
stuff.
self-control.
So conscientiousness, extroversion, gender has shown a difference, just in intention to turnover intentions. So not looking at them from different, distinctive terms, but.
These seem like, free money in terms of shrinking your, ultimately making your experimental design more powerful, your
Yeah.
design more powerful, like subtracting out one or two of these variables.
Age has a big one too. Older generations tend to stay longer. Younger people tend to shift.
So if you guys keep going that way, you're gonna run soon enough into this problem, which is pretty common in your field, which is the large P, low N problem, right? You have a lot of predictors, and then you need a very large N to say anything about those predictors. And
That's where we live on.
there is, right. So there is this method, PLS regression, projection to latent structures regression, which does factor analysis and regression at the same time. So it tries to group the predictors into factors in such a way that they maximally predict the outcome.
Make a note, we might want to ask them about.
It's definitely a mental note.
Projection
I'll
to
make
latent structures regression, PLS.
PLS, projection to latent structures.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I have not done that.
Yeah.
So that solves, or at least mitigates this problem of large P,
Yeah, yeah.
small n.
Nice. I wasn't familiar with that. Are you teaching that? in
So,
2020?
I'm not teaching that.
Good job.
Thank you, Scott.
See you.
I'm not teaching that, but I can help him with it if you want to apply such a method.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd like to learn about it more. Any other questions? Alan,
Comment?
what?
I just want to say this is probably the most intense critique I've seen after a first speech period.
It feels a little bit intense. Just a little bit.
I think we're already.
That's good. I mean, just watching you guys talk about it after, I was sort of grilled there for a little bit, but watching you guys talk about it and discuss it, it makes me feel that I've chosen an interesting topic, and that's good.
You always have a qualifying oral exam, what we always tell the students before they, if a question comes up where the committee members have forgotten the student there because they're now discussing this idea with each other.
Okay.
Throw gas in the fire.
The questions?
Thank you.
Did David ever come on or no? The only one who was on was.
Pam did join. I did not see when Pam joined.
You guys who are online have questions? No questions? Okay.
Thanks
See you
for
next
coming.
time.
Usually when I cover letters, think the person's saying.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea.